So let's return to the argument we are making at this point, that African American slave agency actually contributed significantly to the war's ending, to Northern victory and Southern defeat. And again, we ask, how could this be if slaves, by definition, even do not have free will? And how could they exercise their agency, so to speak? Now, first we have to remember Stephen Hahn's main point. And again, this is that slaves misinterpreted the meaning of the war as about their freedom. The reason why the conflict was actually happening is because the North wanted to free them, right? It's a moral struggle, not anything political. That's the misinterpretation that the slaves held. However, even though slaves had indeed misinterpreted the meaning of the war as about their freedom, they still believed it to be true. And therefore, you see the word spreading among, fellow slaves that the North is waging this war to free them. Now, this involves, as mentioned here, the key ideas, right? First of all, slave misinterpretation of the war, which we just discussed. And the word spreads. And how does it spread? Through this complicated slave communication network. This happened, for example, let's say you have a traveling plantation owner in the South, and he brings his cohort of slaves with him. And of course, when the plantation owner stays for however long he does, traveling in the South from, let's say, one plantation to the next, of course, slaves have to be kept in the slave quarters. And here is where you see the exchange of information. Now, to be honest, a lot of it was, if you will, gossip, half-truths, even some completely false, ideas that were exchanged. But crucially, the idea that was exchanged here in relation to our argument is this. And again, it's that misinterpretation that the North is engaged in this war to free them. And again, that's not exactly true, right? But nonetheless, this communication network is crucial to the word spreading throughout the South. So, what this does is crystallize this notion of slave agency, okay? It begins to form in slaves. And how is this done? Okay, because they're still, as I mentioned, chained, right? They're still slaves. Well, they become emboldened to act, to somehow work their way towards their freedom. Now with the wrong recognition that, this war is being fought to free them. What develops is what historians refer to as a culture of resistance. Okay, culture of resistance. In the context of slaves here, what is part of this culture? What practices? Well, slowing down work, foot dragging, if you will, right? Sabotage, committed within the plantation itself, right? For example, a slave is told to mend a fence here, and oops, the slave forgets to nail in the last few nails, right? To mend the fence. Oh, that leads to the livestock escaping, right? So these are acts of passive resistance, if you will, right? Slowing down productivity on the plantation. But you also see more open acts or increase in black defiance. Okay, by the way, at this point, especially a few years into the war, it becomes a war of attrition, to use my earlier term. And therefore, male presence is needed for the war itself, in the South. So this leads to overseers, masters being brought to the war. And therefore, you see less male presence remain in the plantation. Okay, so this leads to paranoid suspicion in various plantations of a slave revolt. Okay, this fear envelops white communities in the South. So ultimately, upon forming some semblance of agency due to that misinterpretation, the cumulative effect here is the undermining of the Southern plantation economy. Because of less slave productivity, much less, slowing down of labor, increasing acts of defiance, being emboldened to actually escape from plantations. Now, this happened before the war, but certainly, midway through the war, it began to happen to the point where, Southern plantations are losing their labor. All this works to undermine the Southern economy. And in modern times, you cannot win a war without subsidizing, the war effort. And the South, as you know, is purely agrarian. They depend on that slave labor. Yet this labor erodes drastically due to the formation of slave agency. So again, let's remember our focus on meaning here. At first, slaves were wrong about their interpretation of the war as a moral issue. Yet, after the Emancipation Proclamation, they were right all along, right, about the meaning of the war. And in fact, Stephen Hahn, in the article, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says something to this effect, that Lincoln finally caught up with the slaves. Okay, what does this mean? It means that the Civil War, was always about their freedom. And, at the end of the day, in the final analysis, right, it's about black freedom. And even today, that's how we interpret the meaning of the war, right? Because it is actually the real meaning, much less so political. In fact, some, people in the South who believe in the Confederacy, they still couch it in the language of politics, right? More so than morality. So here's the thing. The slaves were right all along in their meaning, even though technically they were wrong, right? And also, hopefully you notice how Lincoln, in shifting the meaning of the Civil War, knew the Emancipation Proclamation would do exactly that. That's a political move to change it from politics to a moral issue, right? Okay, another crucial role here, the second one. Okay, the first one is the argument I just laid out. The second one is the decisive role played by African American troops, especially in the latter half of the war, when the war becomes a war of attrition. You had many escaped slaves, plus some free persons in the North. Free persons, by the way, very small number. I mean, less than 10% of the entire African American population. But they were basically African Americans who were not enslaved, and obviously they lived in the North. So it's comprised of free persons and escaped slaves in the formation of African American troops. In the beginning, there were no black troops. Okay, but after several years, as casualties mounted, Lincoln and the U.S. Army began to reconsider disallowing black troops to serve. By the way, before the war, there was this widespread belief that African Americans could not engage in, quote, civilized combat, unquote. That is to say, modern warfare, following orders, rank and file, drills, strategy, mastering your weapon and all that stuff, right? Rather than pre-modern ways of fighting like feudal wars, right? So there's controversy of whether African Americans could adequately perform on the battlefield. But once committed, here's the crucial part. African Americans interpreted the meaning of the war as about their freedom. Okay, the African American Northern troops, right? They interpreted the war as about their freedom, and therefore, what does that do? it makes African Americans fight with a particular ferocity and courage on the battlefield. And by this time, both sides, the South and North, were weary of war. Okay. By the way, there's a great movie on this called Glory. Okay, it was, I think, a 1990s movie with Denzel Washington. It's really good if you want to see this cinematic depiction of African Americans in the Civil War, African American troops. Now, interestingly enough, if you were a Southern soldier, a Confederate soldier, you certainly held the belief that African Americans were uncivilized. You held on to the worldview of white supremacy, meaning that, there's no way African American troops could defeat whites on the battlefield. But indeed, that's what happens. And this is a big blow to the Southern worldview that pivoted on the assumption of white supremacy, black inferiority, right? The world as you knew it pretty much collapses, interestingly enough. Okay, so hopefully you can see how both African American troops and even the slaves on the plantation played pivotal roles, right, in the outcome of the war. It led to the undermining of the Southern economy, as well as shifting of the war, right, shifting towards Northern victory on the battlefield. And again, hopefully you can see how meaning and interpretation shapes the outcome in history, in this case, the Civil War. And we'll see how this flows into the Reconstruction period.